Just in time, Eleanor Van Hart snatched a delicate porcelain teacup from her husband Charles's hands, her eyes blazing with shock and fury. The luxurious penthouse study glittered around them, city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but all Eleanor could see was a danger in the cup. Charles froze mid-sip as the realization hit him. He had almost been poisoned. Simone, their maid, stood frozen, guilt and fear etched across her face. In that tense moment, Eleanor's sharp mind and fearless instincts saved the night, proving that even in a world of wealth and elegance, danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. The city skyline glittered like a cascade of diamonds against the obsidian night sky, a spectacle befitting the life of Eleanor Van Hart, a woman whose cunning mind and relentless ambition had cemented her place among the world's elite. From a vantage point of her penthouse suite, she could see the sprawling metropolis below, where neon lights danced across glass towers and the pulse of life never seemed to falter. Yet, despite the grandeur and the meticulously curated perfection that surrounded her, Eleanor's mind was a tempest of unease, an undercurrent of dread that gnawed at the edges of her composure. She had always prided herself on her intuition, her uncanny ability to read people and anticipate events before they unfolded. But tonight, that very intuition screamed at her like a siren, warning her that something was terribly wrong. The occasion had begun as a celebration. Her husband, Charles Van Hart, had successfully closed a multi-billion-dollar merger that would solidify his position as one of the most powerful figures in international finance. Guests, dressed in designer finery, mingled in the grand ballroom of the Van Hart estate, champagne flutes in hand, their laughter echoing against the marble floors and ornate gold chandeliers. Eleanor, radiant in a sleek midnight blue gown that hugged her figure with effortless elegance, floated through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to command. Her smile, dazzling and poised, concealed the meticulous calculations that raced through her mind, the endless strategy she wove to maintain control over a world that often seemed precariously balanced on a knife's edge. Yet beneath the glittering veneer of celebration, a darker thread had begun to unravel, a subtle but unmistakable warning. Earlier that evening, she had noticed something in the behavior of her household staff, a fleeting hesitation in the eyes of those who served her. The Van Hart estate was a place where loyalty was not just expected but demanded, and Eleanor had long relied on her most trusted aides to execute her every whim with unerring precision. Among them, there was one who had become more than a servant. Simone, the black maid who had been with the family for nearly a decade. Her presence was almost invisible, yet indispensable. She knew the intricacies of the household, the personal habits of every member, and the unspoken rules that governed the complex social theater of the Van Hart empire. Simone's demeanor had always been impeccable, her loyalty unquestionable, or so Eleanor had believed. It was only after the laughter of the guests faded into the distant hum of the city below that Eleanor's instincts demanded she act. Charles had excused himself to the private study to pour himself a cup of tea, a nightly ritual he rarely skipped. Despite Eleanor's gentle chiding that such habits were unnecessary indulgences. But tonight, something about the ritual felt wrong. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she followed him quietly, the heels of her designer's shoes clicking softly against the marble floors, each step measured and deliberate. She reached the doorway of the study just in time to see him lift the delicate porcelain cup to his lips. The movement, casual and familiar, was betrayed by a sudden hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of unease that mirrored her own. The truth hit her with the clarity of a lightning strike. Someone had tampered with the tea. Eleanor's mind raced as she considered the possibilities, the rare, horrifying chance that someone within her inner circle, someone she had trusted implicitly, had crossed a line that could not be undone. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking evidence, searching for any anomaly in the familiar surroundings, but the study appeared untouched, immaculate, just as it always had been. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second amplifying the terror that clawed at her chest. Poison. The word echoed in her mind with the chilling resonance of inevitability. Eleanor's first thought was disbelief, swiftly followed by controlled fury. She knew the type of poison she feared, silent, invisible, swift, and she also knew that hesitation could be fatal. Her hands, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, reached out to grasp Charles's arm, gently but firmly, pulling the cup from his hand before a single drop could touch his lips. He looked at her, puzzled and slightly alarmed, the initial confusion on his face quickly replaced by trust in her decisive action. "Eleanor, what—" he began, but she cut him off with a sharp, commanding whisper. "Not now. Step back, Charles. Do exactly as I say." Every movement Eleanor made from that moment was calculated, precise, a choreography born of years of navigating high-stakes corporate battles and social intrigues. She guided him to the leather couch near the fireplace, where the ambient warmth seemed almost mocking in contrast to the icy dread she felt. She instructed him to remain seated, hands on his lap, eyes fixed on her, while she moved with the speed of a predator circling her prey. Her gaze swept the room, cataloging every object, every shadow, every detail that might betray the presence of a threat. Her mind, always sharp and analytical, instantly turned to the household staff. Eleanor had never doubted their loyalty, yet intuition told her that betrayal had seeped into the very walls of her carefully constructed sanctuary. "Simone," the thought came unbidden, a whisper in a storm of panic and calculation. Simone had always been one to anticipate her needs, to act as an invisible extension of her will. To imagine treachery from her seemed impossible, but the signs were there, subtle yet undeniable. Eleanor's memory replayed the fleeting hesitation she had noticed earlier, the slight tremor in Simone's hand when refilling the champagne glasses, the way her eyes had avoided direct contact. Every detail, trivial at first glance, now converged into a singular, horrifying picture. With a resolve that left no room for doubt, Eleanor strode toward the kitchen, her mind operating at lightning speed. The household staff, alerted by her sudden departure from the study, paused in their tasks, sensing the tension in the air. Simone appeared at the doorway, her expression carefully neutral, the mask of servitude perfect in its execution. But Eleanor saw through it. Every instinct, every calculation screamed betrayal. She did not hesitate. "Where's the vial?" Eleanor demanded, her voice low but cutting, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Simone's composure wavered. Just barely, a flicker of panic behind carefully controlled eyes. The room seemed to contract around them, the air thick with the weight of unspoken accusation and looming disaster. Eleanor advanced, each step measured, her gaze unrelenting. She had learned long ago that fear could be manipulated, that the mind could bend under the pressure of imminent consequence. Yet this was different. This was not negotiation. This was survival. Charles's life depended on her ability to act without hesitation. Simone's eyes darted toward the counter, where a small, nondescript vial lay partially obscured behind a collection of glassware. Eleanor's heart pounded as she moved faster, seizing the vial before Simone could react. The liquid inside shimmered under the kitchen lights, a pale, almost ethereal hue that confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. She had handled poisons before, in her capacity as a negotiator, a strategist, and a woman who thrived in a world where danger was a constant companion. But the immediacy of the threat, the knowledge that a single drop could end everything, sent a shiver down her spine. Returning to the study with the vial clenched in her hand, Eleanor saw Charles watching her with a mixture of awe and fear. She could not afford words. Not yet. Action was paramount. With the precision of a scientist, she poured the contents of the vial into a specialized container she had kept for emergencies, neutralizing the toxin with a chemical compound she had memorized years ago. The process was meticulous, a delicate balance of timing, temperature, and chemical reaction, yet Eleanor executed it with flawless precision, her mind a symphony of focus, calculation, and resolve. When the task was complete, Eleanor finally allowed herself a fraction of relief. Charles was safe, the immediate danger averted, yet the broader threat remained. Betrayal had infiltrated the walls of their home, and Eleanor knew that it would take every ounce of cunning, every fragment of her strategic acumen, to root it out. As she placed a neutralized vial on the counter, her eyes met Simone's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. One of victory for Eleanor, one of consequence of maid who had dared to breach trust. The night stretched on, the city below oblivious to the drama that had unfolded within the Van Hart estate. Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning, that the threads of conspiracy and deceit would need to be unraveled with care and precision. She resolved in that moment that no one, no matter how trusted, would ever threaten her family again. And as the first faint light of dawn began to creep through the windows, painting the study in muted gold, Eleanor Van Hart, cunning and resolute, prepared herself for the battles yet to come. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of the Van Hart estate, softening the harsh lines of the previous night's turmoil, yet doing nothing to ease the tension that had settled like a shadow over Eleanor's usually immaculate home. Eleanor sat in her private study, the neutralized vial before her, and allowed herself only a momentary pause. Her mind, as relentless as ever, refused the comfort of rest. The events of the night weighed heavily on her consciousness, but she knew that relief was a luxury she could not afford. Betrayal had infiltrated her sanctuary, and now it was her mission to root out the rot before it could fester further. Every instinct she possessed told her that the threat extended beyond the act of poisoning. Someone had carefully crafted this move, one designed not merely to harm her husband, but to send a message, a challenge to Eleanor herself. Charles, now recovering from the shock of what could have been a fatal cup of tea, attempted to resume his usual composure, but the subtle tremor in his hands betrayed his inner unease. He approached Eleanor cautiously, his usual charm subdued, as though aware that the carefully maintained order of their lives had been shattered. "Eleanor, who would do this?" he asked, his voice laced with both confusion and fear. Eleanor met his gaze with the calm, calculating intensity that had become her armor. She would not allow panic to dominate the narrative. "We don't know yet," she said, her tone measured, yet carrying the weight of authority. "But I intend to find out. And when I do, there will be consequences, swift and irreversible." Her mind immediately turned to Simone. The maid's behavior had already raised subtle alarms, but Eleanor refused to act on suspicion alone. She needed evidence, a trail that would confirm the depth of the betrayal. Eleanor's strategy was methodical. She was not a woman to be swayed by emotion alone, even when the stakes were life itself. She began with surveillance, tapping into the sophisticated network of cameras and listening devices she had long kept discreetly throughout the estate. Every movement, every whispered conversation, every interaction between staff and visitors would now be under her scrutiny. Her home had always been a fortress of both luxury and security, but today, those measures were weapons, and Eleanor wielded them with precision. It wasn't long before anomalies began to surface. Footage from the kitchen camera revealed Simone moving with an unusual deliberation, her actions almost imperceptibly different from her usual efficiency. She lingered longer than necessary near the tea set, her fingers brushing against the porcelain with a cautious gentleness that betrayed familiarity with its contents. Eleanor's sharp eyes caught the faintest glint, a small vial, hidden in a fold of her apron, the very one that had nearly claimed Charles's life. The realization confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. This had not been an impulsive act. Simone had planned it, timed it with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Eleanor's mind raced through potential motives. Wealth? Revenge? Coercion? The list seemed endless, each possibility more dangerous than the last. She had trusted Simone implicitly, relied on her for years, and yet now found herself confronting a betrayal that was both personal and insidious. She knew that any misstep could be catastrophic. If Simone sensed Eleanor's suspicion too early, she might destroy evidence, or worse, attempt another, more lethal maneuver. Eleanor had to act with both swiftness and subtlety, like a master chess player anticipating moves 10 steps ahead. The next step in Eleanor's investigation required direct confrontation, but had to be carefully orchestrated. She summoned Simone under the pretense of routine duties, instructing her to organize the inventory in the wine cellar, a task that allowed Eleanor both proximity and control. Simone descended the staircase with her usual grace, unaware that the walls themselves were now instruments of observation. Eleanor followed silently, her every sense attuned to the subtlest signs of deception, a flicker of the eye, a shift in weight, a hesitation in breathing. Once in the cellar, Eleanor's strategy became evident. She allowed Simone to work, pretending to attend to other matters, all the while noting inconsistencies, discrepancies, and any indication that the maid's actions had deviated from standard protocol. And then she observed it, a momentary lapse in concentration, A glance over the shoulder, a subtle adjustment of her sleeve that revealed a familiar outline. The vial. Eleanor's lips curved in a controlled, almost imperceptible smile. This was the confirmation she needed. Simone had underestimated her. She had assumed loyalty was an absolute, unbreakable bond. Eleanor intended to teach her the consequences of such misjudgment. The confrontation itself was a study in psychological warfare. Eleanor approached Simone quietly, her presence so sudden and commanding that the maid nearly dropped the glass she held. "Simone," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of steel beneath a veneer of calm civility. "We need to talk." Simone turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. But Eleanor could read the tension radiating from every fiber of her body. This was no longer about words. It was a contest of wills, and Eleanor intended to dominate from the first move. "You've made a serious mistake," Eleanor continued, her tone even, measured, yet charged with unspoken threat. "Attempting to harm Charles, to harm my family, is not just a betrayal of trust. It is an act that will not go unanswered." Simone's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor saw fear flicker in her eyes, quickly masked by a veneer of composure. But Eleanor was relentless. She had studied human behavior extensively, and she could see through the carefully constructed facade. She knew that fear, when manipulated correctly, could force even the most calculating individual to reveal their intentions. Simone's voice was steady, almost defiant, but Eleanor detected the tremor beneath the surface. "You don't understand," she said, her words carefully measured, designed to create doubt and hesitation. I had no choice." Eleanor's sharp mind cataloged every nuance, every subtle cue. No one coerced Simone into the act. This had been premeditated, carefully calculated. Her words, her demeanor, betrayed not desperation, but intent. Eleanor's next move required not only psychological acumen, but the full deployment of her resources. She reached into her bag, withdrawing a small, elegant device capable of recording every word, every nuance without detection. "This conversation," Eleanor said, her voice cold and unwavering, "is being recorded. Every explanation, every justification will be documented. And when the authorities or my security team review it, your actions will speak louder than any excuse you could offer." Simone's composure cracked ever so slightly, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, a fleeting bite of the lip. Eleanor pressed further, probing, testing, forcing the maid to reveal more than she intended. Slowly, layer by layer, the truth began to emerge. The act had not been personal in the sense Eleanor initially feared. It had been a transaction, orchestrated by forces beyond the walls of the Van Hart estate. Someone had manipulated Simone, leveraged her position of trust, and turned her into an instrument of chaos. The realization sent a cold shiver down Eleanor's spine. This was bigger than a simple household betrayal. It was an infiltration, a calculated strike against the Van Hart empire itself. With the first pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Eleanor knew her next moves would require both finesse and ruthlessness. She could not allow panic or emotion to dictate her strategy. Every action had to be deliberate, every decision precise. Charles's life was already saved, but the larger threat loomed like a shadow over their lives. The enemy, whoever they were, had tested the perimeter, and Eleanor intended to find them, to dismantle their plans with the same precision she had applied to every other challenge in her life. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the sprawling estate, Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities. Surveillance footage would be reviewed, staff interrogated subtly, communications analyzed with the rigor of a forensic expert. She would uncover every thread of conspiracy, every shadow of manipulation, and she would do so without giving her adversaries a single hint of her awareness. Her intellect, her cunning, and her unyielding will would be the instruments of justice and retribution. By midday, Eleanor had mapped out a preliminary strategy. Simone would remain under close observation, her actions monitored and recorded. At the same time, Eleanor began to trace the invisible threads that connected the attempted poisoning to the broader networks that orchestrated such attacks. Contacts in finance, politics, and private security were engaged discreetly, each one providing intelligence, each piece a fragment of the emerging mosaic. Eleanor moved with the confidence of a master strategist, every step calculated, every decision a maneuver in a game whose stakes could not be higher. And through it all, Charles remained at her side, a mixture of admiration and apprehension in his eyes. He had always relied on Eleanor's brilliance, but the events of the past 24 hours had revealed the true depths of her cunning, the extraordinary lengths she would go to protect those she loved. The bond between them, forged in years of shared ambition and mutual respect, was now tempered in the fires of crisis, stronger and more unbreakable than ever. By the end of the day, Eleanor had gathered the first threads of the conspiracy, identified anomalies in communications, and begun to chart a course that would lead her to the mastermind behind the attack. The realization that her life and her husband's life depended not only on speed but on flawless execution imbued her with singular focus. There would be no mistakes. There could be no hesitation. Eleanor Van Hart, cunning, fearless, and unrelenting, was preparing to strike back at a force that dared to challenge her dominion, and she would do so with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a queen. The Van Hart estate, usually a fortress of comfort and control, now felt like a labyrinth of threats and shadows. Eleanor moved through it with the precision of a predator, her every step calculated, her senses attuned to the slightest anomaly. The attempted poisoning had been only the opening move of a much larger, more dangerous game, and Eleanor knew that the forces arrayed against her would not remain idle. The realization sharpened her mind, honed her instincts, and ignited a relentless determination to uncover the truth. Whoever had orchestrated this attack was bold, audacious, and cunning, and Eleanor Van Hart was a woman who thrived on challenges that required intellect, courage, and ruthless strategy. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source: the estate's network of discrete security feeds and encrypted communications. Eleanor had always maintained meticulous records, not merely for security, but as a way to anticipate potential threats. Reviewing footage from the previous weeks, she noticed subtle patterns, minor inconsistencies in the scheduling of staff movements, brief, almost imperceptible interactions between Simone and an unknown individual during late-night deliveries, and encrypted messages intercepted in the estate's secure network. Each anomaly was insignificant on its own, but together, they formed a coherent narrative pointing toward a mastermind operating beyond the walls of the Van Hart empire. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she traced the digital breadcrumbs, realizing that the scope of the conspiracy was both sophisticated and deeply personal. She discovered that Simone had been approached by someone with intimate knowledge of the Van Hart household, someone who understood the routines, the vulnerabilities, and the ways in which Eleanor exerted control. The name behind the manipulation remained elusive, but the clues were there. Financial transfers disguised as routine transactions, coded messages in mundane communications, and subtle behavioral cues carefully orchestrated to elicit compliance. Eleanor, a woman who had navigated the labyrinthine corridors of high finance and elite society, recognized the sophistication of the plot. It was no ordinary act of revenge or greed. It was a calculated strike against her family, designed to destabilize, intimidate, and test her resolve. Eleanor's next step was decisive. She convened a covert meeting in her private study, summoning a trusted cadre of advisors, security specialists, and legal experts. These individuals had been loyal allies for years, bound not only by contracts and compensation, but by the recognition of Eleanor's extraordinary acumen. She laid out the evidence, methodically analyzing every anomaly, every inconsistency, and every potential lead. Her approach was analytical and systematic, leaving no detail overlooked. Each advisor contributed insight, but it was Eleanor's vision that shaped the strategy: to identify the mastermind, neutralize the threat, and restore absolute control over her empire. Simone, now under continuous observation, became a central figure in the unfolding investigation. Eleanor approached her with a mix of psychological pressure and calculated leniency, maintaining a delicate balance between threat and opportunity. The maid, fully aware of Eleanor's vigilance, gradually revealed fragments of information: cryptic mentions of meetings in dimly lit cafes, the exchange of coded messages, and a figure always lurking just beyond the periphery. Eleanor listened intently, parsing every word, every hesitation, every nuance, to assemble a clearer picture. The web of deception was complex, but Eleanor's intellect was sharper, capable of weaving disparate threads into a coherent narrative. As the investigation progressed, Eleanor realized that the mastermind was someone who not only understood the Van Harts intimately, but also had access to vast resources and networks. This was no petty criminal or disgruntled employee. This was an individual who wielded influence and power, capable of orchestrating events with precision and foresight. Eleanor's pulse quickened at the thought, but she did not falter. Fear had no place in her calculations. Instead, she channeled the adrenaline into a strategic advantage, planning each move with the foresight of a chess grandmaster anticipating the endgame several steps ahead. One night, as Eleanor reviewed communications logs and surveillance footage, she noticed a pattern that had eluded her until then, a recurring anomaly in the travel patterns of certain luxury vehicles associated with high-profile corporate meetings. The vehicles appeared to converge at discrete locations at irregular intervals, often coinciding with the timing of messages sent to Simone. Eleanor's analytical mind pieced together the implications. The mastermind was not only directing Simone's actions, but also coordinating a network of operatives to execute a broader plan, one that could potentially compromise not only the Van Hart household, but the empire itself. The realization brought both clarity and urgency. Eleanor could not rely solely on passive observation. She needed to engage, to probe, to bait the mastermind into revealing themselves. She devised a series of calculated maneuvers, subtle provocations designed to elicit a response. Every interaction with Simone, every adjustment to the estate's routines, every monitored communication was an instrument of strategy. Eleanor understood the psychology of those who sought to manipulate and control. She knew how to predict reactions, exploit weaknesses, and turn fear into leverage. Her plan required precision and timing. Eleanor orchestrated a scenario in which Simone would be forced to make contact with a mastermind under controlled conditions, a digital trap designed to capture every detail. Sophisticated monitoring tools recorded encrypted messages, digital footprints, and behavioral cues, all meticulously analyzed in real time. The tension in the household was palpable, though externally, Eleanor maintained a veneer of calm and control. Every decision, every subtle maneuver, reinforced the dual reality. The Van Hart estate remained a bastion of opulence and composure, while beneath the surface, Eleanor conducted a high-stakes operation to protect her family and dismantle a conspiracy that threatened to engulf them. Days passed in a blur of analysis, surveillance, and careful interrogation. Eleanor's brilliance was on full display as she anticipated each potential move of the mastermind, countered subtle threats, and gradually tightened the net around the orchestrator of the attack. Simone, increasingly anxious yet compliant, revealed further information under the psychological pressure Eleanor applied with expert precision. Each revelation brought Eleanor closer to understanding not only the identity of the mastermind, but also the scope of their ambitions, the extent of their resources, and the methods by which they sought to destabilize her family. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Eleanor traced a pattern in the financial transactions tied to Simone, uncovering a series of transfers that led to a shell corporation with links to an international consortium of high-powered individuals. These individuals had both the motivation and the means to challenge the Van Hart empire, and their coordinated efforts demonstrated a level of sophistication that matched Eleanor's own strategic capabilities. She realized that the mastermind was not a single entity but a network, a coalition of influential figures who had underestimated Eleanor's intelligence and resolve. Eleanor's response was swift and decisive. She convened a second, more specialized team, experts in cybersecurity, private investigation, and corporate espionage, to execute a multi-pronged counteroffensive. Each move was designed to dismantle the network's infrastructure, expose their methods, and protect her family from further harm. Eleanor herself assumed a central role, personally guiding the strategy, analyzing intelligence, and anticipating every countermeasure the adversaries might deploy. Her intellect and courage combined to form a force as formidable as any she had encountered in her life. In parallel, Eleanor deepened her engagement with Simone, using a combination of psychological insight and strategic pressure to extract further critical information. The maid, realizing that resistance was futile, began to reveal the intricacies of the network's operations, the timing of covert meetings, the methods of communication, and the ultimate goals of the orchestrators. Eleanor listened with meticulous attention, each detail meticulously recorded, each clue carefully analyzed. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a vivid, terrifying picture of the challenge she faced. Yet Eleanor's resolve never wavered. By the end of the third week, Eleanor had mapped the conspiracy with near-complete clarity. The network, sophisticated and dangerous, had underestimated the cunning and resourcefulness of the woman they sought to manipulate. Eleanor now stood on the precipice of confrontation, armed with intelligence, strategy, and the unyielding would protect her family at any cost. Every move she made, every decision she executed, brought her closer to the final act, a confrontation that would test her courage, intellect, and ruthlessness in ways she had never before experienced. Eleanor understood that the stakes had escalated beyond mere survival. The conspiracy threatened not only her family's lives, but also the empire she had painstakingly built alongside Charles. Yet, with the clarity of purpose and precision of intellect, Eleanor prepared to strike, knowing that in the complex game of power, manipulation, and betrayal, only one force could emerge victorious: the woman who had been underestimated, the genius who had turned the tables, and the protector who would not allow the Van Hart empire to fall. The night air hung heavy with anticipation over the Van Hart estate, the city below unaware of the storm about to break within its marble walls. Eleanor moved with purposeful precision to the corridors, every step measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the meticulous plan she had executed over the past weeks. The final phase of her strategy, the confrontation with the mastermind, was at hand. She had traced a network of conspirators to a single location, a discreet, high-rise office building in the city's financial district, a fortress of glass and steel where power and influence intermingled with secrecy and danger. Eleanor knew that this confrontation would not be simple. The adversaries were cunning, experienced, and ruthless. Yet, she had anticipated every move, every contingency, and now she was ready to act. Charles, ever the loyal partner, accompanied her with a mix of admiration and concern. Though he had previously relied on Eleanor's intellect and strength, the events of the past month had revealed the extraordinary depth of her cunning. He trusted her implicitly, and in the quiet moments during their car ride to the city, he marveled at the calm intensity she radiated. "Are you certain about this, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice laced with apprehension. Eleanor's eyes, cold and calculating yet vibrant with purpose, met his. "There's no uncertainty in this," she replied. "We move, we act, and we finish this. They underestimated me, Charles. That was their first and final mistake." The building loomed before them, its facade glittering with the sterile glow of corporate opulence. Eleanor had already orchestrated every detail. Security protocols were subtly manipulated, entrances monitored, surveillance systems discreetly overridden, all to give her complete tactical advantage. She entered with a controlled confidence, moving as if she belonged in the boardroom of power that lay beyond, rather than an interloper seeking retribution. Her mind cataloged every detail: the placement of cameras, the patterns of guards, the silent alarms that could be triggered by a misstep, and she adapted her movements with the precision of a master strategist. Inside, the mastermind awaited, though Eleanor did not yet know their full identity. From the shadows of the high-rise office, a figure emerged, poised, composed, with an air of arrogant certainty that had likely guided them through countless manipulations. Eleanor's gaze was unwavering, and as she stepped closer, every element of her being projected authority, intellect, and unyielding resolve. The figure smiled, a calculated, patronizing expression, as though confident in their advantage. "I expected someone cunning, but not this precise," the mastermind remarked, their voice smooth and confident. "I underestimated you, Eleanor. I suppose that makes you dangerous." Eleanor allowed herself the faintest of smiles, controlled and sharp. "Dangerous is not an option," she said, her voice steady and cutting. "It's a requirement." Every word was a deliberate signal, every syllable a psychological probe designed to destabilize, to reveal weaknesses. Eleanor had spent weeks anticipating this moment, tracing every link, decoding every subtle clue, and she prepared herself for the psychological duel that would follow. She had to extract the truth, neutralize the threat, and ensure that the empire she had built alongside Charles remained unchallenged. The dialogue that followed was a battle of intellects, subtle maneuvers, and veiled threats. The mastermind attempted to assert control through intimidation, weaving narratives of inevitability and dominance. But Eleanor countered each move with precision. She revealed the evidence she had painstakingly gathered: encrypted communications, financial transactions, surveillance footage, all meticulously presented to demonstrate that every action had been anticipated and accounted for. The tension in the room was palpable, as the air thickened with the clash of wills between two formidable minds. As the confrontation escalated, Eleanor's strategic brilliance became undeniable. She had transformed the office into a controlled environment, a stage on which every reaction of the mastermind could be observed, predicted, and exploited. Security systems that had seemed innocuous were suddenly leveraged to isolate the adversary, prevent escape, and capture incriminating data. Eleanor's meticulous planning left no room for improvisation on the part of the mastermind. Every contingency had been anticipated, every potential advantage neutralized. The adversary, once confident in their manipulation, began to falter, their composure cracking under the relentless pressure of Eleanor's intellect and resolve. The breakthrough came as Eleanor subtly triggered the final piece of her plan, a digital trap that exposed the mastermind's entire network of operations, communications, and financial manipulations. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving the figure no recourse but to acknowledge defeat. Eleanor's voice, firm and commanding, cut through the tension. Your network, your influence, your manipulations, they end tonight. You underestimated me, and that was your critical error. Every move, every scheme has been documented. Every action will have consequences. Defeat, however, did not come easily. The mastermind, realizing their position was untenable, attempted a final act of desperation, a concealed weapon, a silent alarm. But Eleanor's anticipation and preparation neutralized every threat. Security personnel, operating under her discreet commands, swiftly contained the situation, ensuring that Charles, Eleanor, and her team remained safe. The confrontation ended decisively. The mastermind was captured, their operations exposed, and their network dismantled. The danger that had loomed over the Van Hart empire was eradicated, leaving Eleanor triumphant and unchallenged. Returning to the estate, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had unfolded. The attempted poisoning, the manipulation of Simone, the hidden network of conspirators, all had tested her intellect, courage, and strategic prowess. She had confronted betrayal, navigated a web of deceit, and emerged victorious, safeguarded her family and her empire. Charles, visibly relieved, embraced her, recognizing the extraordinary combination of brilliance and bravery that had preserved their lives. "You're remarkable, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. Eleanor's response was measured, confident, and tinged with quiet triumph. Remarkable is not enough. Survival requires precision, strategy, and unyielding will. And that is what I gave. In the days that followed, the Van Hart estate returned to its customary rhythm, though the lessons of betrayal and danger remained etched in Eleanor's consciousness. She strengthened security protocols, enhanced surveillance measures, and ensured that every potential vulnerability was addressed. Yet, beyond the measures of physical security, Eleanor's true strength lay in her intellect, her ability to anticipate threats, and her unwavering resolve to protect her family at all costs. Simone, having witnessed the full extent of Eleanor's strategic brilliance, remained within the household, though her role and trust had been permanently recalibrated. The lessons of loyalty, manipulation, and consequence were clear. Eleanor Van Hart, cunning, fearless, and unparalleled in intellect, had not only thwarted a life-threatening conspiracy, but had reaffirmed her dominion over every aspect of her life and empire. The city continued its relentless pulse beneath the estate, oblivious of the drama that had unfolded in its shadows. Yet Eleanor knew that vigilance, intelligence, and decisive action were the ultimate safeguards in a world where betrayal could emerge from the most trusted quarters. As she stood once more in her penthouse, surveying the glittering skyline, she felt a familiar surge of clarity and power. Every challenge, every threat, every adversary had been confronted and overcome. The Van Hart empire remained intact, stronger and more secure than ever, a testament to the extraordinary cunning and unyielding will of the woman who would allow nothing to impair her family or her dominion.